The door shouldn't have opened that easily. I remember standing on the back steps of that old Victorian driftwood in one hand, fog curling around my ankles. I pushed, and the plywood shifted with a groan. The house was supposed to be abandoned, boarded up since before I was born. But something inside smelled lived in, not clean, not recent, just lived in. And I hadn't even stepped across the threshold when I heard the cough, a quiet, raspy sound coming from somewhere deep in the house, like someone who'd been waiting a long time to be noticed. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever gone inside a place you probably shouldn't have. And if these stories keep you company, I hope you'll join me again next time. My name's Jake Monroe. I was 21 when this happened. It's been about 3 years, and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. At the time, I was a junior at UC Santa Barbara, studying marine biology. Thanksgiving had just passed, and I'd gone home to Carpinteria to spend the break with my parents. That was a mistake. They'd been fighting more than usual. My dad's drinking had gotten worse, and Mom was hanging on by a thread. On the second night, they got into it again, slamming doors, shouting, glass breaking. I grabbed my keys and left without saying a word. There's this stretch of coast just south of town, not a tourist beach, just cliffs, an ice plant, and the steady crash of water below. When I was a kid, my mom used to take me there after school to watch the tide come in. That night, I drove out there without thinking. I just needed air distance, a place that didn't belong to either of them. That's when I saw the house again. It sits alone on the bluff where the road curls inland, an old Victorian 3 stories tall, flanked by twisted cypress and thick fog. Locals call it the Whitmore House, but nobody talks about it much. Just another abandoned relic. I'd passed it 100 times growing up, always wondering what it looked like inside. That night, something made me stop. I don't know if it was the way the ocean fog clung to the windows or how the porch light, long dead, seemed to glow faintly in the dark. But I pulled over and walked toward it like I was being led. The gravel shoulder was half washed out from winter rains, and the path up was choked with weeds and thistle. My boots crunched over broken shells and dry leaves. The boards over the windows were warped and cracked, and I could hear the wind whistling through the eaves like a distant radio. Around the back, one of the boards covering the side door had come loose just enough to slide a piece of driftwood under and pry it away. That's when the door creaked open, and the smell hit me. It wasn't just dust or mildew. It was wood rot, sea salt, and something else. Something faintly metallic like old coins in the back of your throat. I stepped into what used to be the kitchen. My phone flashlight barely lit more than a few feet, but I could make out the faded avocado green cabinet's linoleum, curling up at the corners, and wallpaper so old it had peeled into long yellow ribbons. Everything looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1970s. Pots still hanging on hooks, a sponge on the sink dry and cracked like coral. I should have turned around, but I kept walking. Something about that place felt sad, not dangerous, like it had been waiting to be remembered. That's when I heard the cough, soft, close, definitely human. I turned, heart racing, and aimed my light at the doorway to the next room. A man was standing there, mid-50s, maybe older. Faded flannel jeans held up with a bit of rope. His hair was wild salt and pepper, and his eyes were pale blue, so pale they looked silver in the beam of my flashlight. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, voice low, almost kind. "Name's Theodore. Teddy, if you prefer." I introduced myself, Jake, and said I was just passing through. Needed a quiet place to think. He nodded like he understood that completely. Said this house had always drawn people in when they were lost. "Been doing it for decades," he added. "She remembers who needs her." I don't know why I didn't leave right then. We sat in the old living room across from each other in two dusty chairs that creaked every time we shifted. He'd set up a little camping lantern on the mantel, gave off a warm amber light that made the peeling walls look like old parchment. He told me he used to be a carpenter, that he'd worked on houses like this when he was younger. Said he'd been staying here for a few weeks, maybe longer. It was hard to tell with Teddy. Then he started talking about the Whitmore family, the ones who built the house. Henry Whitmore made his fortune in oil, moved his family out west in the 1920s. They had 3 kids, but it was the youngest Helen that Teddy spoke of most. 16. Vanished in 1978, right before Halloween. She was light, he said, staring into the dark, like wind chimes in a summer breeze. He described her green eyes, a silver locket she wore every day, the way she laughed when she ran down the stairs barefoot. It was all too vivid, too personal. I asked how he knew so much. He said he found old letters upstairs, photo albums, police reports, that the family left everything behind when they fled the house. He said Henry stayed here alone until he died in 1981. Some say of a broken heart. Around midnight, he offered to show me the room upstairs where he kept the clippings. "It's like a little museum," he said. "You should see it." I didn't want to go. Everything in my gut told me to thank him, walk out, and never look back. But I was 21, curious, and not as careful as I should have been. The stairs groaned with every step. The second floor smelled worse mildew and wet wood, with a sharp undertone I still can't name. At the end of the hall, Teddy opened a door, and my light fell on what looked like a shrine. Newspaper clippings pinned in rows across the walls, photos of Helen, school portraits, beach shots, even a few Polaroids taped above a desk. And not all of them were old. Some looked recent, Helen in clothes from this decade, Helen trying to cover her face, Helen scared. That's when I noticed the silver locket on the desk, the same one Teddy had described. I picked it up and everything changed. "You shouldn't touch that," he said, voice flat now, eyes cold. I asked again how he knew so much. He just smiled, a horrible, empty smile. "I've been taking care of Helen for a long time," he said. "She gets restless when strangers visit." Then I heard it, scratching, from inside the wall, deliberate, rhythmic. Teddy turned to the wallpaper and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here." The nice boy just wanted to hear your story. I didn't wait. I ran. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the broken door. I swear I heard him laughing as I hit the gravel. The laugh sounded older than Teddy. Hollow. Like it had come from somewhere deeper than the house itself. In the rear-view mirror, I saw 2 figures in the upstairs window. One tall, one smaller. The police checked the place the next day. Said it was empty. But they found scratches in the walls. Fresh ones. 3 years later, I still drive past that bluff sometimes. The boards are still there. The house looks the same. But I'll never go back. Because I know Teddy's still in there. And I think Helen is too. I don't usually dream about the place anymore, but when I do, it always starts the same way with that old carousel music, playing at half speed, dragging each note out like it's stuck in syrup. The sound comes from somewhere I can't see, drifting between rows of rusted booths and broken rides, and no matter how far I walk, the music never gets closer. It just follows me. I was back in Cedar Ridge last spring. Our grandmother had passed, and the whole family was gathering for the funeral. My sister Lily and I hadn't been home in years. We left for different reasons, but the result was the same. We never looked back. But grief does strange things, and after the service, we found ourselves driving aimlessly around town, killing time before the dinner. That's when we ended up near the edge of town at the old Wonderland Park. It had been shut down since 2006, ever since Tommy Brennan, a little boy from our school, vanished during the 4th of July celebration. One minute he was holding a balloon near the bumper cars, and the next he was gone. The search lasted weeks, and the park closed almost overnight after that. No formal explanation, just silence. They locked the gates, posted a sign, and left it to rot. We hadn't planned to stop, but we did. Lily was the one who suggested we go in just for old time's sake, she said. She always had that streak, rebellious, restless, and annoyingly persuasive. I should have said no. But standing there with the summer heat pressing down and the air thick with mosquitoes, I could still hear our grandmother's voice laughing as she handed us cotton candy. The memories felt warm, harmless. We found a spot in the chain-link fence where the metal had been bent low and rusted through, easy enough to slip under. The moment we stepped inside, the whole park felt wrong, still, like the place had been holding its breath for 17 years. Weeds pushed through every crack in the pavement. The rides looked like skeletons, metal frames stripped of paint signs, faded to gray. The Ferris wheel loomed high above us, but it didn't look like it would survive another winter. The carousel was worse. Its horses were frozen mid-gallop, mouths open, chipped paint around the eyes that made them look like they'd been crying. Several were missing limbs. We walked in silence for a while, passing old game booths and food stands. It was eerie, but familiar. Until we reached the row of storage trailers behind the main strip. Most were sealed shut with rusted chains, but one stood slightly ajar, its door swinging gently, even though there wasn't a breeze. Lily didn't hesitate. She stepped up to it while I stayed back, fiddling with a rotted ring-toss bottle. Ash, she called, her voice lower than usual. You need to see this. The inside of the trailer wasn't dusty or abandoned like the rest of the park. Someone had been using it, recently. Candy bar wrappers, Snickers, Kit Kats were scattered on the floor. A small lantern sat on a makeshift table. In the corner, a child's clothes had been folded into a neat pile, a blue jacket, striped socks, a pair of light-up sneakers that looked brand new. A teddy bear sat beside them, one eye missing but clean. Lily picked up a notebook from the table and flipped through it slowly. Page after page of childish drawings, the Ferris wheel, the carousel, stick figures with enormous eyes. The drawings weren't old. The pencil lines were sharp. The paper wasn't yellowed. Someone had been using it recently. That's when I saw the Polaroid. It was taped to the wall with peeling masking tape, a young boy standing in front of the carousel. The image was too sharp, the colors too vivid to be from 2006. He was wearing the same blue jacket folded in the corner. We didn't hear the carousel music right away. It came slowly, like something winding up from a long rest. The old calliope tune started playing distorted and dragging, as if the motor hadn't run in years. But we knew that carousel had been broken since the year Tommy disappeared. It shouldn't have made a sound. I whispered for Lily to drop the notebook. We backed out of the trailer and started walking fast, not running yet, but close. The rows of booths looked identical now, like the whole layout had changed behind our backs. The carousel music followed us distant but never fading. The horses on the ride seemed to move just slightly, as though shifting in place. We passed the fun house. I glanced into the cracked mirrors and caught movement, not ours. Something taller standing still as we walked past. We didn't look again. We just kept moving. When we reached the fence, the gap we'd crawled under was gone, wired shut with silver ties that looked brand new. I felt a tightness in my throat that I couldn't explain. Not fear exactly, not yet, just the sudden realization that we were not supposed to be here. That's when we saw him. A man stepped out from behind the old ticket booth, maybe in his 60s. Faded overalls, gray hair clinging to his scalp in stringy strands. His eyes didn't seem to blink. In his arms, he carried what looked like a child at first, but it wasn't. It was a mannequin toddler-sized, dressed in the blue jacket from the trailer. A face had been drawn on it with markers. Crooked smile, red dots for cheeks. He didn't speak, just walked past us slowly toward the carousel and gently placed the mannequin onto one of the horses, adjusted its arms, tilted its head just so. Then he turned to face us and mouthed something. No sound came out. Lily didn't wait to figure out what he said. She spotted a weakness in the fence by the old restrooms, a spot where the wooden post had rotted. We kicked at it, pushed, he pulled. He started walking toward us again, slower than before, but completely focused. Still carrying that awful thing. We broke through the fence just as his hand brushed Lily's jacket, left a dark smear on the fabric. We didn't speak until we were in the car. Engine running parking lot fading behind us in the mirror. In the rear view, I saw him standing at the edge of the fence, cradling the mannequin head tilted slightly. The music had stopped. We drove straight to the police station and told them everything. At first, they didn't seem to believe us until we mentioned the supplies, the photo, the clothes. That's when a detective came out. Burgess, I think his name was. He'd worked the original Tommy Brennan case. He showed us a photo, a man named Walter Cray, maintenance worker. Was questioned back in 2006, but released. They lost track of him after that. I told him that was the man we saw, no doubt. They sent a search team to the park that night. But by the time they got there, the trailer was empty. No wrappers, no clothes. The fence had been repaired again, old boards like it had never been disturbed. But they did find one thing. A Polaroid stuck in the wire where we'd escaped. A new one. It showed Lily and me running through the park. Neither of us remembered anyone taking it. They tore down Wonderland Park a few months later. Underneath it, they found tunnels, rooms, Polaroids going back decades, and the remains of 4 children, including Tommy Brennan. But they never found Walter Cray. Now and then, Lily calls me late at night, says she hears carousel music in her dreams, says she sees the mannequin standing in doorways. I don't tell her I hear it too. I don't usually talk about this. It's one of those memories that makes people stop what they're doing and just stare at you, not because they think you're lying, but because they can't figure out what to say next. It happened during the summer of '87 when I was 16 and stuck in a town that didn't offer much more than heat and boredom. Maple Hollow had one grocery store, one gas station, and a main street that shut down by 6 p.m. Most of my friends had part-time jobs or family chores to keep them busy. Me and the guys I hung around with, Kevin, Bobby, and Chris, we didn't have much of either. We were just four restless teenagers who'd already spent too many nights walking the same cracked sidewalks, passing around a warm can of soda, waiting for something to happen. Kevin was the one who came up with the idea. He always had that kind of reckless charisma that made you follow him even when your gut said not to. We were sitting out behind the train tracks one evening, watching the sun drop behind the grain silos, when he turned to us and said, "We should break into the sanatorium." He said it like it was nothing like we were talking about climbing a tree or sneaking into a movie. But we all knew what he meant. Riverside Sanatorium sat at the edge of town, up on a hill covered in overgrown brush. It had been abandoned since the late '60s when the state finally shut it down. Before that, it was a tuberculosis hospital. Hundreds of people had died there over the years. You'd hear stories, older kids talking about strange lights, faces in the windows, cold spots in the hallways. But most folks avoided the place. You could feel it when you drove past. The building didn't look haunted exactly. It just looked wrong, empty in a way that went deeper than boarded-up windows and locked doors. Kevin said we'd only go for an hour, just the first floor, just long enough to take a few photos with the disposable camera he carried everywhere that summer. I told myself we'd be back before anyone even noticed we were gone. I remember feeling uneasy the whole next day, but I didn't back out. None of us did. We met up behind the water tower at 9 p.m. just after dark. The sky was still warm with leftover heat, but the breeze had picked up and the night smelled like dry grass and asphalt. We rode our bikes out to the sanatorium, cutting through back roads to avoid traffic. When we reached the fence, Kevin showed us the gap he'd found a few weeks earlier, a spot where the chain link had been clipped and folded back, just enough for us to slide through. We left the bikes in the bushes and walked up the crumbling driveway. The building looked even bigger up close. 5 stories tall, red brick faded to gray windows, like dark eyes watching us approach. The front doors were chained, but Kevin knew where to go. Around the side, near the old loading dock, a metal service door hung crooked on its hinges. A vine had forced its way through the gap, keeping it from sealing shut. We slipped inside one by one, our flashlights barely cutting into the dark. The air changed immediately. Colder. Still. And something else, a smell I couldn't quite place. Stale metallic with an undercurrent of hospital cleanser long since dried. The hallways were narrow and peeling. Paint hung in strips from the walls. Water stains bled down from the ceiling. Every step we took echoed off the tile floor like the building was reminding us how empty it was. Kevin took the lead flashlight held high, camera slung around his neck. Bobby stuck close behind him, whispering to himself now and then. Chris was at the back, quiet as ever, but alert. I stayed between them, trying not to let my fear show. We passed old patient rooms, some with rusted bed frames still bolted to the floor. Cabinets stood open, their shelves long empty. In one room, someone had spray-painted "Get out," in dripping red letters across the far wall. Bobby laughed nervously and muttered something about cheap horror movies. None of us joined in. It was about 30 minutes in when Kevin found the door to the basement. It was a heavy wooden thing, painted the same sickly institutional green as the rest of the building. When he pulled it open, a wave of cold air poured out like the building had been holding its breath for decades. The smell hit us harder down there, rot chemicals, something sweet and spoiled. Bobby backed away immediately. Chris shook his head. But Kevin grinned like a kid on Christmas morning. "Just one room," he said. 5 minutes. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe I didn't want to look scared. Maybe I thought 5 minutes wasn't long. Either way, I followed him down. The stairs creaked with every step. The walls were damp, and the flashlight beam caught glints of moisture that shimmered like eyes. The basement was a maze of corridors, each one darker and more narrow than the last. We passed old gurneys, wheelchairs with cracked leather straps, tables that looked like they hadn't been touched in 50 years. Kevin snapped pictures as we went, the camera flash lighting up the dark in harsh white bursts that only made everything feel more unnatural. Then he found a door at the end of one hall that didn't look like the others. It was metal, newer than the rest, painted a dull gray. No handle on our side. Just a deadbolt locked from outside. Kevin found a metal pipe nearby and started prying at the frame. It took a few minutes, but eventually, with a sound that echoed through the hall like a gunshot, the door gave way. Behind it was a tunnel. Narrow, low ceiling, brick walls. The air inside was different, warmer, humid, and almost earthy. Kevin stepped in without hesitation. I called after him, but he didn't respond. I followed. The tunnel sloped downward. The walls were slick with condensation. I could hear water dripping somewhere ahead. Kevin's flashlight was barely visible now, just a pinpoint of light in the dark. I called his name again, louder this time. He said something back. I couldn't quite hear it. Then nothing. I kept walking slower now, the tunnel pressing in on both sides. The temperature felt wrong. The air was thick, hard to breathe. Then his light vanished, just blinked out. I stopped, waited, called his name. The silence was total. After a few more minutes, I turned back. I don't remember running, but by the time I made it up the stairs, my chest was heaving and my hands were shaking. Bobby and Chris were still there, eyes wide. I told them Kevin had gone into a tunnel and hadn't come back. They wanted to go after him. I said no. We searched for 4 hours. Nothing, not a trace, no tunnel. When we returned with the police the next morning, the metal door was gone. In its place was a brick wall aged like the rest of the building. The officers searched the basement, the stairwell, every room we'd seen. Kevin was gone. They called it a runaway. Said he probably hitched a ride out of town, but we knew better. 32 years later, in 2019, I got a call. The city was demolishing Riverside Sanatorium to make room for a strip mall. During excavation, workers broke through a sealed chamber beneath the basement. Inside, they found skeletal remains. Dental records confirmed it was Kevin. No signs of trauma, no obvious cause of death. Just bones curled in on themselves in a dark room that wasn't supposed to exist. They reopened the case. I gave another statement, but I kept most of the truth to myself. Some things are better left in the dark. Back in 2014, the year I retired and moved into my late brother's old farmhouse, I spent most mornings at the public library. Bakersville's never been more than a blip of a town, a grocery, a post office, and a single stoplight, but its library sits on the corner like it belongs in a bigger place. Red brick, tall windows, ivy growing wild up the south wall. It's one of the oldest buildings still standing, and one of the few in town that hasn't been gutted and turned into something else. I liked it for its quiet. The aisles were narrow, and the floor creaked in familiar places. There was an old green armchair near the history section where I'd settle in with a mystery novel or some old travel book. It wasn't unusual to spend 2 or 3 hours there without saying a word to another person. I'd nod to the college kid behind the desk, maybe glance at the bulletin board on my way out. That was enough company for me. That summer, I started bringing my grandson Ethan along a few mornings each week. His parents both worked long shifts at the clinic, and I was happy to watch him. Ethan was bright in that quiet, curious way some kids are, always asking questions but never demanding answers right away. He loved the library as much as I did, though he'd make a beeline for the back corner children's nonfiction mostly. Dinosaurs, airplanes, deep-sea creatures. The books always came back a little more worn than before, pages turned gently, but often. One Tuesday in late July, something changed. It was just after 10 a.m. I was thumbing through a book on Montana's old mining towns when I noticed Ethan wasn't in his usual spot. I walked over expecting to find him sprawled on the floor with a book open in his lap, but the section was empty. I called his name softly, then a little louder. Still nothing. I rounded the corner and checked the bathroom. The front desk even peeked out the front windows. No sign of him. I was starting to feel that strange, tight kind of panic, not loud, not flailing, but cold and creeping, when I heard something behind me, the sound of a door closing. Now the only obvious door near the children's area led to a storage closet. I'd never seen it open before. I walked over and pressed my hand to the knob. It turned easily. The room was dark and cool, with the smell of paper and dust thick in the air. Shelves lined the walls filled with old reference books and donation bins. I called out again, and this time I heard a voice. Ethan's voice. But it was faint, like he was behind another wall or farther underground. Then I noticed the stairs. They were partially hidden behind a stack of plastic storage tubs, leading down through a narrow opening in the far wall. I had never seen them before. There was no light switch I could find, but just enough daylight from the closet spilled in to show that the stairs were made of concrete, chipped and worn with age. I hesitated. Ethan's voice floated up again. I went down. The stairs turned once and opened into a long, low-ceilinged hallway that looked nothing like the rest of the library. The walls were stone, not drywall, but real old stone, the kind you see in root cellars or hand-dug wells. The floor was packed earth, uneven and slightly damp underfoot. My footsteps made almost no sound. I followed the hallway, calling his name. It wasn't fear that filled me then, not yet. It was confusion, disbelief. This part of the building didn't make sense. The library wasn't big enough to hide something like this. Then I saw the door. It was wood, dark and warped with time, but intact. No knob, just a small brass latch. Carved into the frame were the words, "Records Room, Authorized Staff Only." I opened it. The room beyond was surprisingly large. Rows of old filing cabinets lined the walls and tables had been arranged in the center, each covered with ledger books, rolled maps, even dusty typewriters. It looked like something out of the 1930s, preserved but forgotten. The air was heavy with mildew, and something else, the faint smell of oil and ink. And sitting in the middle of the room on one of the wooden stools was Ethan. He didn't look frightened, just focused. He was leafing through a thick, leather-bound book, his fingers moving slowly across the pages. I asked him what he was doing, and he looked up with the calmness only children seem to have in moments that rattle adults. She said, I could look, he told me. I asked him who. He pointed past me toward the doorway, but there was no one there. I took his hand and told him we were going back upstairs. He didn't resist, but as we walked back down the hall and up the stairs, he kept glancing over his shoulder. I asked him again outside in the daylight who she was. He said her name was Miss Valerie. That was a name I hadn't heard in decades. Miss Valerie had been the head librarian when I was a teenager, strict but kind. Always smelled like rosewater and wore long skirts with deep pockets. She died in 1981. I remembered because the town held a candlelight vigil on the library lawn. I didn't mention that to Ethan. The next day, I stopped by the town clerk's office and asked about the basement beneath the library. Gloria, who'd worked there since the 70s, looked at me like I'd grown a second head. She said there hadn't been a basement under the library since before the remodel, in 1959. When I described the hallway and the records room, her expression changed. Very slowly, she opened a drawer and pulled out a faded blueprint. It showed the original layout, and there it was. A narrow set of stairs and a large basement room labeled Local History and Archives. She tapped the paper with one crooked finger. They sealed it off during the renovations. Flood damage or mold, I think, was supposed to be filled and closed for good. I told her it wasn't. She just nodded once and said, "Well, maybe it forgot." I never found that closet door again. A week later, it was just smooth drywall, no knob, no frame. Ethan didn't bring it up again, but now and then I'd catch him staring at the corner of the library like he was listening for something. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't followed him that day, or if I'd let him stay in that room a little longer. Some doors stay shut for a reason. But some, I think, wait for the right person to walk by and open. I don't usually talk about cleanup jobs. Most of them blur together after a while. Sunken trailers, hoarder homes. The occasional summer cabin overrun by mildew and raccoons. But this one's stuck with me. Not because of anything we found above ground. It's what we unearthed beneath the property that still gives me pause, especially when I think about how close I came to going down there alone. Back in 2017, I got contracted to clear out an old homestead about 20 miles outside Dry Fork, way up in the hills, where the cell signal dies, and the roads feel older than the town itself. A woman named Roberta had inherited the land from her uncle, who'd passed away a year earlier. She wasn't planning to keep the house, just needed it cleaned out so she could sell it as is. The listing mentioned a root cellar, but no one had used it in years. She told me she didn't even have the key. It was mid-May, warm enough that the scent of pine hung thick in the air, but still cool in the shade. I'd brought along Jack, my usual partner. We got there mid-morning and walked the place first. Creaking porch, broken screen door, windows, clouded with grime. Inside, It was mostly empty. Just old furniture, yellowed wallpaper, and the smell of mice. Nothing unusual. We didn't find the cellar hatch until that afternoon. It was behind the house, near the edge of a stone retaining wall that had started to collapse in one corner. A rusty sheet of metal half covered it, looked like someone had tried to seal it off with a piece of siding and a few bricks. The door was wood swollen from rain, with an iron ring set into the top. When we cleared the debris and opened it, a wave of cold air rolled out that didn't match the weather. Jack whistled. Still, air down there could mean mold. We lowered a flashlight into the opening. Stone steps led down steep and narrow. The walls were rough concrete, no signs of reinforcement. There were shelves carved into the sides built in, and at the bottom the light caught on what looked like an old mattress. I told Jack I'd go down first and check for safety. He said, "Be my guest," and handed me the flashlight. I didn't make it to the bottom. 5 steps and the temperature dropped like someone flipped a switch. Not just cool, cold, the kind that gets in your teeth. I paused and shone the light around again. That's when I noticed the scratches. Long, shallow grooves in the concrete wall near the top of the stairs. A cluster on the right side, then more along the inner wall as the stairs turned. They looked like claw marks, except they weren't deep, more like something dull had scraped them in desperation. I turned back and told Jack we were going to need masks and gloves. It looked like someone might have lived down there recently. Or not, I couldn't tell. We figured it might have been used as a shelter during storms or hard winters. Roberta hadn't mentioned anything like that, but old families in these parts had all kinds of secrets. The next day, we came back with gear. I made it all the way to the bottom that time. The floor was dirt cold and packed hard, that mattress I'd seen. It wasn't just a mattress. It was a full cot surrounded by crates filled with canned food, mostly expired by decades. On the wall above it, someone had written names. Not painted or scratched, just penciled in careful, almost childlike handwriting. There were over a dozen names, first names only. Some had small dates beside them, 1998, 2002, 2006. The most recent was 2015. And next to that one, there was a single word, gone. Jack didn't like that. I didn't either. We found more oddities. A mirror nailed crookedly to the far wall fogged at the corners. A child's dress folded neatly over a chair, though it was so old it had begun to fuse with the fabric beneath it. No dust, though the space was too cold for much settling. On a shelf above the cot, we found notebooks. I opened one and skimmed a few pages. It was a journal of sorts. But the entries didn't make sense. They don't talk to me after dark. She says we're safer when we whisper, scratching from the vent again last night. I flipped to the back. One page read only, "Don't go above if you hear humming." I shut it and handed it to Jack. He didn't read it, just set it back on the shelf and said, "Let's call Roberta." When we reached her by phone later that afternoon, she was confused. Said her uncle was a recluse, never spoke much to anyone. She had no idea the shelter was even there. She offered to come up the next morning. That night, I stayed in town. Jack drove back to his place near Elkins. I didn't sleep well. Something about the air in that cellar stayed with me. Not the cold, but the stillness, the unnatural silence of it. When I closed my eyes, I saw the names on the wall. I started to wonder if they were real people or something else. Roberta arrived just after sunrise. She was polite, but distant, seemed more annoyed at the inconvenience than disturbed. When we showed her the cellar, she didn't speak for a while, just stood at the top of the steps and looked down, her face tight. "I knew he went strange toward the end," she said. "Didn't think it was like this." Jack asked if she recognized any of the names. She shook her head slowly, then paused. "That last one, the one marked Gone. That's my sister's name. She disappeared when she was 17. We thought she ran off. She didn't stay long after that. Told us to board the place up and burn whatever we didn't need to haul. We finished the job 2 days later. I took one last look before I sealed the hatch. The chair was still there. The dress was still folded, the mirror still crooked, but the notebooks were gone. I never saw Roberta again. Jack moved to Kentucky later that year. Sometimes I wonder if he ever dreams about that place. I do, especially when I hear humming in the dark. Back in 2019, I took a 3-month nursing contract at a small hospital up in Mendocino County. It was one of those stretches where I needed quiet, and Northern California in early fall is about as quiet as it gets. I rented a cottage on the edge of a Forest Service road, just one of those old Park Service dwellings with wood paneling, a warped front porch, and a screen door that didn't quite close unless you yanked it. I liked it. It felt tucked away from the world. Most evenings after work, I'd walk a short trail that looped from behind the cottage down toward a narrow fire break, a bare, straight line of cleared land about 10 feet wide that cut through the trees like a scar. I'm not sure why they never let it grow back in. Maybe they kept it for wildfire containment, or maybe it was just habit. Either way, it always gave me the same odd feeling. Like I was standing in a hallway that had no walls, but someone could still watch you from the ends. One of the locals, an older man named Cole, used to stop by every now and then to check the well pump. He was a retired forest ranger, all sinew and weathered skin, and he always carried himself like he was still on duty. The first time he saw me coming up from the fire break, he tilted his head and asked real casually, "You walk down that line much?" I told him. "Yeah, almost every evening." He squinted for a second, then said, "Wouldn't do it too close to sundown. Just feels off that stretch. Been that way for years." Then he tapped the side of his boot with his knuckle and walked back to his truck. At the time, I chalked it up to backwoods superstition. I've worked in enough small towns to recognize that tone. Folks who've lived too close to the same trees for too long start seeing things in the bark. Still, the next few nights, I kept my walks to earlier in the day. I didn't say anything to my coworker, Lacey, but I started to notice how folks at the hospital got weird when I mentioned the trail. Not scared exactly, just quiet, like they weren't sure what you were asking. The first thing that really made me stop using it happened about 3 weeks in. I'd gone walking a little later than usual. The sun was behind the trees, throwing long shadows down the fire break. I remember the quiet so still you could hear your own breath shift in your chest. About halfway down, I saw something out of place. A stack of small rocks balanced perfectly just to the side of the trail. Maybe 6 stones, maybe 7. I looked around and didn't see anyone nearby. When I got closer, I noticed a piece of red fabric caught on a branch just above it, sun-bleached, but it looked like a torn hoodie sleeve. I didn't touch it, just backed away and turned around. That night, I texted Cole and asked if hikers came through here often. He called instead of replying. Told me nobody had cleared that trail for years. Said even the fire crews stopped using it because of reports. When I asked what kind of reports, he just said, people walking it too long and coming out wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. Around 2:00 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. Not heavy ones, just a soft shift in weight like someone trying not to creak the boards. I held my breath and waited, but nothing else came. In the morning, I found a single scuff mark on the welcome mat. No shoe print, just the kind of drag you get when someone turns mid-step. 2 days later, we got a call at the hospital. A pair of hikers had gone missing near the National Forest line. Search crews went out and eventually found them the next evening, both dehydrated, disoriented, but otherwise unharmed. They kept repeating that they hadn't gotten far from the trailhead. They said they'd only been out there a few hours. But their GPS tracker, still running on one of their phones, showed they'd wandered over 8 miles from the last point of contact. When someone asked how that could be, one of them started crying and said, "We kept seeing him, just ahead, but every time we got close, he'd be somewhere else." I didn't say anything, but I knew what they meant. I'd never seen anyone directly, but twice now, once at dusk, once near dawn. I'd caught a figure through the trees just off the trail. Not moving, not watching. Just present. Like he'd been standing there before I arrived, and I'd interrupted something. I started parking further down the road to avoid walking past the fire break, but it didn't seem to matter. A week later, I came home from a late shift and found the cottage colder than usual. The heater was running, but something felt off. I walked past the kitchen and stopped dead. Someone had placed a small pile of smooth stones on the center of the dining table. 7 of them. No dust, no signs of a break-in. Just those stones clean and perfectly stacked, like they were waiting for me to understand something. I called Cole that night, told him what I saw. He got real quiet, then asked if I'd ever gone off the trail. I said no. He told me to keep it that way. Then he asked if I still had the stones. I said yes, they were still on the table. He said, "Don't throw them out. Just take them down to the ranger shed. Leave them on the porch. Don't look back when you leave." That was the last time I saw him. When I dropped the stones off his place, looked empty. A few weeks later, someone at the hospital told me he'd moved in with his son down near Eureka. But when I tried to mail him a thank you note, it got returned no forwarding address. I finished my contract and didn't renew. Before I left, I took one last drive down to the fire break. I didn't walk, it just sat in my car at the trailhead and watched the wind move through the trees. The light was low that amber hour when shadows start blending with the trunks. And just for a second, I saw a shape shift at the far end of the break, like someone walking from one tree to another, but never quite stepping into the open. I never told anyone at the next hospital why I left Mendocino early. I just said I didn't like the fog. But some nights when I hear wind through the siding, I remember that crooked scuff mark on the mat. And I wonder if I brought anything back with me. I used to stop in small towns whenever fatigue caught up with me on long drives. Most truckers preferred the chain motels along the interstate, but I always had a habit of pulling off into the older places, the kind that had a flickering vacancy sign and only one car in the lot. In 2011, I pulled into Gallatin, Missouri on a wet spring night. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the town looked deserted except for the amber glow of a single neon light above a sagging roofline. The sign read simply, "Rooms," though half the letters had burned out. The office smelled faintly of mildew and coffee left too long on the burner. A woman in her 60s sat behind the counter, her green coat buttoned all the way up to her chin, though the room was overheated. She slid a brass key across the counter without looking me in the eye, and told me the room was at the far end. I asked if she needed my name for the ledger, but she shook her head once, as if the question were unnecessary. The old-fashioned key had a plastic tag with the number 9 stenciled on it. The brass was cold in my hand, colder than it should have been. The parking lot was empty, the pavement slick with rain. Room 9 stood at the far end, the curtains drawn tight. When I opened the door, the room smelled of furniture polish and something faintly metallic. The bedspread looked new but sat unnaturally smooth, like no one had ever touched it. I unpacked nothing, only set my bag by the chair and stretched out on top of the covers. For a while, the only sound was the faint tick of water dripping from the gutter outside. Around midnight, I woke to the unmistakable sound of a television. The walls were thin, but it wasn't the muffled noise of another guest's TV. It was crisp, clear, coming from the small unit in my own room. The problem was I hadn't turned it on. The picture showed nothing but static, the screen glowing faint blue across the bedspread. I reached for the remote, but it wasn't on the nightstand. I checked the dresser, the chair, even beneath the bed, but there was no remote anywhere in that room. The static hiss seemed to swell until it filled the air like heavy pressure. I unplugged the set from the wall and the glow died. Relieved, I settled back onto the bed. But minutes later, when I glanced toward the corner, the television was on again, the cord dangling loose, not even touching the socket. This time there was an image. A woman in a green coat sitting very still, her face turned slightly away from the camera. She was in the same office where I had checked in, only the walls behind her looked bare, stripped of their paneling. Her lips moved as though she was speaking, but no sound came through the static. I should have left then, but fatigue and something else, maybe shame, kept me still. I told myself it was a local channel bleeding through, though I knew that wasn't how televisions worked anymore. I pulled the cord entirely from the back of the set and laid it on the floor in plain sight. When I turned back to the bed, the woman on the screen had shifted. She was facing forward now, eyes wide, mouth still moving in silence. The glow from the screen was the only light in the room, and in that light her eyes seemed too large, as if stretched across her face. I left the television humming behind me and went outside. The mist had thickened into fog, and I could barely see the office door across the lot. I told myself I would check out, get back in the truck, sleep at a rest stop if I had to. But when I opened the office door, the chair behind the counter was empty. The coat was draped across it, green fabric damp as though it had just come in from the rain. The ledger lay open on the counter, the last entry written in looping, faded handwriting. It read, Room 9, Thomas Leary. My stomach turned cold. I hadn't signed anything, hadn't written a word. I called out, but the office was silent. The coffee pot sat empty, crusted with old grounds. Dust lay thick across the counter where my hand had brushed only an hour earlier. I looked down at the page again. Below my name, there were more entries, dozens of them, each with dates going back decades. Some were scratched out. Others ended abruptly. The most recent before mine was 1987. I dropped the key on the counter and stepped back into the night. The fog was so dense now that the outlines of the motel blurred the rooms, dissolving into gray. When I turned toward where my truck should have been parked, I saw only empty pavement glistening under the single street lamp. My rig was gone. There was nothing left but the hiss of the static drifting out of room 9's thin curtains. I walked until dawn, following the highway shoulder until a county deputy pulled over and asked if I was all right. When I told him where I had stayed, he frowned, said the motel had been torn down in the 90s, said the lot was still empty, fenced off with chain link. I never argued. I only thanked him for the ride to the next truck stop and bought the strongest coffee they had. I've never driven through Gallatin since. Looking back on all of these places I've spoken about tonight, I realize they share something I can't quite define. None of them were famous landmarks or destinations. They were quiet stops, forgotten corners, the kinds of places people pass through without a second thought. Yet it's always those forgotten spaces that seem to hold something back, as if memory itself has roots in them, waiting to trip anyone who lingers too long. The details differ: an old motel, a remote cabin, a silent highway, but the feeling never changes. It's that stillness that presses in when the world feels emptied of witnesses, when you begin to notice what doesn't quite fit. A voice where there shouldn't be one, a light burning where no one lives, a name written down when you never wrote it. Maybe these things are just tricks of fatigue and imagination. Or maybe they are reminders that we never really travel alone, no matter how empty the road looks. For me, the unsettling part isn't the moments themselves, but the way they linger afterward. Years pass, but I still feel them at the edges of memory, just as vivid as when they first happened. Perhaps that's the nature of places we're not meant to stay. They do not want to be forgotten, and so they follow us into our dreams, into our quiet hours, into nights like this one. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this night's stories. If you've enjoyed them, I'd be glad if you subscribed, shared this with a friend, or returned here for the next collection. I wonder, have you ever passed through a place that seemed ordinary at first, but left you unsettled long after you left it behind? Good night, and take care on the road ahead.